By the third day, everyone in the palace knew who'd done it, and not one of them knew anything at all. That's the thing about a palace when a secret gets out. It doesn't wait for the truth, it can't. The truth is slow and the wanting to know is fast. And so the palace makes its own truth in the gap, builds it out of grudges and guesses and the names people already wanted to say. And by the time the real truth comes limping in 3 days or 3 weeks later, the made-up one has already hardened into fact and no one will let it go. I watched it happen. I watched a whole palace decide in 3 days who had leaked the princess's secret. And I watched them decide it not because they knew, but because the name they chose was the name they'd been waiting to say. And I am going to tell you the true story, the slow, ugly, true one, because I'm the only one who went looking for it. And what I found was nothing like the name everyone said. And I'll tell you the strangest part first, so you'll keep reading through the slow telling. The most hated woman in that palace, the one whose name everyone said, turned out to be the only truly merciful person in the whole place, and I'm the only one who ever knew it, and she made me promise in her way to let the world go on hating her. So this is me breaking a promise 40 years late to a dead woman who chose to be hated. She'd forgive me, I think. Or she wouldn't, she was hard. But she's gone and the truth shouldn't die with me, so here it is, the breaking of the promise, the truth she paid her whole name to keep buried, dug up at last because someone should know what she really was. The secret was the worst kind. The Princess Caitrin, wife of the heir, beloved, young, was ill, gravely. A wasting sickness that the household had kept sealed inside its walls for months, not out of shame, but out of mercy, because a sick princess is a thing the whole kingdom feels it owns, and the household had wanted to give her the one thing power so rarely gets, which is privacy in her suffering, time to be ill without the whole realm watching and weighing and mourning her before she was even gone. The physician's reports, the details of the illness, how bad it was, how long she might have, all of it sealed, known only to a small circle, guarded like a state secret because it was one. And then it got out. Not the bare fact of her being unwell, which the realm half suspected, but the details, the private medical truth of it, the worst intimate particulars, appeared suddenly outside the walls, in the mouths of the pamphlet writers and the market gossips and the foreign courts. The princess's most private sickness spread open for the whole world to paw through. My name doesn't matter much for this, but you should have it. I was Aldous, a guard of the inner household, long-serving, the kind of old, reliable furniture they post near the important rooms because I'd proven 1,000 times I saw nothing and said less. I saw plenty. I just said less. And when the leak broke and the palace went mad hunting the leaker, I was close enough to all of it to watch the hunt go exactly the wrong way, and old enough, and tired enough of the way palaces lie to themselves, to go looking the right way instead, alone. I've waited until everyone in it is past being hurt by the telling before I told it. That's why it's taken me so long, not because I was unsure of the truth. I've been sure of the truth for 40 years, but because the truth, told too soon, would have undone the very mercy it was about, would have hanged the man Morwen chose to save and shamed the choice she chose to make. So I held it until they were all beyond my telling's reach. The princess long mourned, Morwen long in her grave, the scribe an old man or a dead one somewhere far from here, and only now, with no one left for the truth to wound, do I set it down so that it exists, so that somewhere outside my own old failing head there's a record of what actually happened the year the whole palace agreed on a lie. You're holding that record now. Hold it carefully. It cost a good deal, the truth in it, and it was nearly never told at all, and it has no villain in it, which is the hardest kind of true story to tell, because the world wants villains and I have none to give you, only the people, only what they actually did, only the grief at the bottom of all of it. The name everyone said was Lady Morwen. I have to tell you about Lady Morwen, and I have to tell you carefully, because the whole point of this story is how wrong they were about her, and you'll only feel the wrongness if you first feel how easy it was to believe. Lady Morwen was the Dowager, the old king's widow, the heir's stepmother, the Princess Caitrin's stepmother-in-law. And she was, by every account, not a warm woman. Cold, proud, sharp-tongued, the kind of great lady who'd spent 40 years in courts and had the armor to show for it, who didn't trouble to be liked because she'd learned long ago that being liked and being safe were different things, and she'd chosen safe. She and the young princess had never been close. There'd been the usual frictions, the old queen and the young one, the way there's always friction between the woman who held a place and the woman who holds it now. People had seen them be cool to each other. People had heard Morwen say sharp things. And there was politics, of course, always politics. Morwen had her own faction, her own grandchildren with their own claims, her own reasons, the palace whispered, to want the heir's beloved wife diminished, to want sympathy for Caitrin turned to spectacle, to want the household that had sidelined her embarrassed before the realm. So when the leak broke, the name assembled itself almost on its own. Who benefits, the palace asked, the way palaces always ask, and the answer the palace wanted was Morwen, because Morwen was cold and Morwen was disliked and Morwen had politics and Morwen had never pretended to love the girl. Within a day it was everywhere. Within 2 it was certain. Within 3 it was simply true, the way the made-up things become true. The Dowager leaked the princess's secret to shame the household and serve her faction. Everyone knew it. You could see it in how they looked at her. The whole palace had tried and convicted a cold old woman in 3 days on no evidence but her coldness, and was already, in the way it spoke of her, hanging her. The princess herself, because she was more than a leaked secret, and she deserves to be more here. I've talked about the Princess Caitrin as a secret, a sealed report, the thing that leaked, and that's a kind of second wrong done to her, to let her be only the secret. So let me give her back her personhood for a moment, because she was a person before she was a scandal, and she deserves to be one here. She was young, and she'd married into the household young, the heir's wife, and she'd done the thing that's hardest in a court, which is to be genuinely good in a place that rewards being clever instead. She was kind in the unguarded way, kind to the servants, kind to the guards, the kind of royal who learned your name and remembered your wife's illness and asked after it, not as a performance but because she actually held people in her mind, actually cared, which is rarer in a palace than you'd ever believe. I'd guarded near her for years, and I'd watched a whole household come slowly to love her, not because they were ordered to, but because she'd earned it one small kindness at a time, and that love was real, was the realest thing in the household. And it was that love that had sealed her illness so carefully, because you protect fiercely the privacy of someone you actually love. You can't bear to see them pawed at by the world. And that's what made the leak such a wound, not the political embarrassment which the palace cared about, but the violation of it, the way a young woman who had been so careful and kind, who was suffering the worst thing a body can suffer, had her most private agony spread open for strangers to discuss. They talked about her in the markets, argued about her symptoms, wagered some of them on how long she had, as if her dying were a horse race. A kind young woman dying by inches had her death made into public entertainment, and that's the real harm the leak did, the harm under all the political noise, the stripping of the last privacy from a person who'd spent her short life giving other people their dignity. When I think of why I couldn't let the thing rest, it wasn't only Morwen, it was this too, that Caitrin had been violated in her dying, and the palace's response was to hunt a scapegoat instead of grieving the violation, to make the leak about who to hate instead of about the kind young woman whose last privacy had been taken. She deserved better than to be a secret. She deserved better than to be a scandal. She was a kind young woman dying too young, and the world turned her dying into gossip, and the palace turned the gossip into a witch hunt, and somewhere under all of it the actual person, the one who'd remembered your wife's illness, was just trying to die in peace and being denied even that. I never forgot she was a person. It's half of why I went looking. The other half was Morwen. Both of them in the end, women the palace failed to see truly. One made a scandal, one made a villain, and neither of them the thing the palace decided they were. How the name spread, the mechanics of it, because a smear has machinery and you should see it work. I want to show you how the name spread, step by step, because I watched it happen and it taught me more about palaces than 40 years of guarding ever had. And because the machinery of it is the same machinery everywhere, in every court and every town, the same way every time. It started the way these always start, not with a claim but with a question. No one stood up the first day and said Morwen leaked the secret. What happened the first day was that people asked, in the frightened, hungry way, who could have done this, and someone, I never learned who, said the thing that wasn't an accusation but was worse than one, said, well, who benefits, and let the name hang unspoken in the air. Who benefits? It's the most poisonous question a palace knows, because it skips clean past evidence and goes straight to grudge. It doesn't ask who did this. It asks who would I like to have done this and dresses the wanting up as reasoning. Who benefits? And the answer everyone reached for was Morwen, because Morwen was the one they'd have liked to be guilty. And the liking became reasoning, and the reasoning became suspicion, and the suspicion became, by the third day, simple fact. And here's the part that stayed with me. At no point did anyone lie exactly. That's what made it so hard to stop. Each person only passed on a little, a question, a maybe, a have you considered, a well you know what she's like. No one invented a false witness or forged a false letter. They just each added their small grain of who she is to the pile, and the pile, made entirely of small true grains about Morwen's coldness, became a great false mountain that buried her. The smear wasn't built of lies. It was built of true small things. She is cold, she is proud, she has politics. She never loved the girl assembled by the wanting into a false conclusion. That's the terrible craft of it, that you can hang someone with nothing but true grains arranged by malice into a false shape. And everyone who added a grain can tell themselves they only spoke the truth, and the woman hangs just the same as if they'd all lied. I watched a palace murder a reputation with nothing but accurate small observations pointed by want. And not one of them ever had to tell a single lie to do it. And that's the thing I most needed you to see, because it's how it's always done everywhere to this day. I should have believed it too. That's the honest place to start. I had no reason not to. I disliked Morwen the way everyone did, found her cold the way everyone did, and the story fit, it was clean, it had a villain the right shape. By every measure I should have nodded along with the palace and been glad the leaker was found, even if found only by gossip. But I'd stood guard a long time, and standing guard a long time does something to a man's ear for the truth. You spend decades watching people, the real grain of them, the small true things they do when they think no one important is watching, and you learn that the clean story is almost never the true one. That the truth is always messier and stranger and has loose threads the clean story doesn't account for. And there were loose threads. Small ones. Things I'd seen, standing furniture, still near the important rooms, that didn't fit the story of Morwen the leaker, and that nagged at me the way a wrong note nags, quiet but insistent under all the loud certainty of the palace. I'd seen Morwen, twice, in the months of the princess's illness, do something the cold villain story couldn't hold. I'd seen her go to the sick room. Not summoned, not for show, no audience, late, quiet, alone, the cold old dowager going to the bedside of the young woman she supposedly hated, and staying an hour more, and coming out with a face that I'm old. I've seen a lot of faces coming out with a face that had been crying or near it. The careful armored face of Lady Morwen cracked and wet at the edges in an empty corridor where she thought no one furniture important enough to matter was watching. I'd seen that. Twice. And it didn't fit. A woman who hated the girl doesn't sit an hour at her sickbed alone with no one watching and come out having wept. That's not what hatred does. That's what something else does. Something the palace's clean story had no room for. And the wrongness of it nagged at me. And 3 days into the certainty that Morwen was the leaker I found I couldn't swallow it, because I'd seen her weep in a corridor for a girl she was supposed to want destroyed, and the palace hadn't seen it, and I had, and a man who's seen the loose thread can't unsee it. So I did the thing nobody asked me to do and nobody thanked me for. I went looking for the real leak. Not to clear Morwen, I didn't even like Morwen. I want that on the record. This isn't a story about a man defending someone he loved. I went looking because the wrong note wouldn't let me be. Because 40 years of watching had taught me that when the palace is most certain, it's usually most wrong. And because somewhere under the dislike, I knew that hanging the wrong person, even a cold, unlovable one, for a thing she didn't do, is its own kind of leak, its own kind of wound to the truth. And I'd spent my life guarding against wounds and couldn't stand by for this one just because the victim was a woman nobody liked. Why I couldn't let it stand, my own history with the name everyone said. I told you I went looking for the truth, though I didn't even like Morwen, and you might wonder what drove a man to all that trouble for someone he didn't love. I'll tell you. It's because I'd been the name everyone said once long ago, and I knew from the inside exactly what they were doing to her. Years before, when I was young in the household, a thing went missing, a valuable thing from a guarded room, and I was one of the few with access, and I was new, and I was poor, and I was therefore exactly the shape of person a palace likes to be guilty, and the name everyone said was mine. I hadn't done it. I never did learn who had. The thing was quietly recovered and the matter dropped before it came to trial, and I was lucky, luckier than Morwen. The truth surfaced in time to save me. But for a few weeks I lived inside the name everyone said, felt the whole household decide my guilt out of nothing but my newness and my poverty, felt the looks, the certainty, the way people I'd thought decent arranged the true small grains of who I was, new, poor, with access, into a false mountain that nearly buried me. I know what it is. I know exactly what it is, to be guilty in every eye for a thing you didn't do, to feel the clean story harden around you while the truth limps somewhere far behind, and to know that if the truth doesn't hurry, it won't matter that you're innocent, the story will have you. So when I watched them do it to Morwen, cold, unloved Morwen, the perfect shape for a palace's guilt, the way poor New Aldous had been the perfect shape decades before, I couldn't stand at my post and let it happen, not because I loved her, but because I'd worn the name everyone said, and I knew it was a kind of murder, the slow, clean kind that needs no blade, and I'd sworn, the time it nearly killed me, that if I ever saw it being done to another, I'd not be one of the comfortable watchers who let the clean story stand. I'd been saved by a truth that surfaced in time. The least I could do, having been saved, was be the surfacing truth for someone else, even someone I didn't like, because liking was never the point. The point was that the name everyone says is almost never the truth, and someone who knows that from the inside has a duty to go looking, especially for the unloved, because the loved at least have defenders, and the unloved have only whatever stubborn old guard decides their coldness shouldn't be a death sentence. I started where the secret had been kept, because a leak is a question of access before it's a question of motive, and the palace had skipped straight to motive because motive is where the grudges live. The sealed reports, the physician's writings, the private medical truth of the princess's illness, had been held in a small circle, and I made myself a list of that circle, the people who'd actually had access to the real details, the only people who could possibly have leaked them, because you can't leak what you never had. And the list was short, and the list did not, when I was honest, much feature Lady Morwen. That was the first thing the palace's story got wrong, the thing nobody checked because nobody wanted to. Morwen, the Dowager, the sideline stepmother, had not actually been inside the small circle that held the sealed reports. She'd known the princess was ill. Everyone in the inner household knew that much. But the details, the sealed particulars that had leaked, Morwen hadn't had them. Couldn't have leaked what she'd never been given. The palace had convicted her of spilling a cup she'd never been allowed to hold, and not one of the certain accusers had stopped to ask whether she'd ever held the cup at all, because the story didn't need her to have held it. The story only needed her to be the kind of woman you could believe had. The actual circle, The people who truly had the sealed details was a handful. The chief physician and his one trusted assistant, two senior members of the princess's own household, her closest women, a scribe who'd copied the reports for the small number of sealed copies, the heir himself, and a single advisor he trusted. That was near the whole of it. 8, 9 people. Somewhere in those 9 was the leak, because it had to be. The details had been real, exact, the true sealed particulars, which meant they'd come from someone who'd held the true sealed particulars, and that was these 9 and no one else, and Lady Morwen was not among them, and the palace was busy hanging her anyway. I won't walk you through every step of the ruling out, because an investigation is mostly tedium and wrong turns, and you don't need all of mine. But I'll give you the shape of it, because the shape matters. I watched the 9. Quietly, the way I watch everything, the furniture still watching that no one notices. I learned their days, their habits, who they spoke to outside the walls, where the thread might run from each of them to the pamphlet writers and the gossips who'd spread the secret. And one by one, mostly, they came clear, not because I proved them innocent, you rarely prove innocence, but because the thread wasn't there, the connection to the outside, the motive that held up, the behavior of someone who'd done a terrible thing and was hiding it. The chief physician was a man broken with grief over his failure to cure her, no leak in him, only sorrow. The 2 senior women of her household loved her past any question, had given their lives to her care, would sooner have died than spread her suffering for the world to paw. The heir's advisor was a cold political creature, but a careful one, far too careful to leak a thing that brought his own master only pain. One by one, the obvious threads came up empty, and I began to worry I'd find nothing, that the leak had been some accident, some carelessness, untraceable. And then I found the one that wasn't empty, and it was the saddest thread of all, and it ran somewhere I'd never have looked if I'd been hunting a villain instead of hunting the truth. The watching, what it is to investigate quietly as furniture, while a palace hunts the wrong way. I should tell you what the investigation actually felt like, the doing of it, because it wasn't the clean, clever thing the songs make of investigations. It was slow and lonely and full of the particular dread of a man doing a forbidden thing under everyone's nose. I had no authority to investigate. That's the first thing. No one had asked me. The household had its own people on the hunt, official ones, and they were all pointed at Morwen, building the case the palace wanted, and here was I, an old guard, furniture, doing my own quiet hunt in the opposite direction with no leave to do it and no protection if I were caught. Because I would have been in trouble, real trouble, if the household's official hunters had learned that one of the guards was running his own investigation that cut against their certainty. It would have looked like I was protecting Morwen, like I was part of her faction, like I had my own guilty reasons, and the same machinery that was hanging her in whispers would have turned on me in a heartbeat. So I did it all in the cracks. In my off hours, on my rounds, in the long furniture still watches where no one notices what the old guard's eyes are doing. I watched the 9 of the circle the way I'd watched everything for 40 years invisibly, and I followed threads on my own time, in plain clothes, in parts of the palace, and the town a guard had no business in, always with the low dread that I'd be seen, be questioned, be made the next name everyone said. And it was lonely in a way I hadn't expected, because I couldn't tell anyone. The one thing that might have helped a confidant, someone to think it through with, was the one thing I couldn't have, because to tell anyone was to risk everything, and so I carried the whole growing weight of it alone, the suspicion, the ruling out, the slow, terrible approach to a truth I increasingly didn't want to find. There's a particular loneliness in knowing a thing the whole world has decided differently about, in being the one man walking against the certain crowd, and I walked against it alone for the better part of a month, furniture by day and a forbidden hunter by night, and I aged in that month, I think, more than the years should have given me. Going against the name everyone says is the loneliest work there is, because the everyone is all around you, certain, comfortable, and you are one old man with a wrong note in your ear and no one to share the weight. It was the scribe, but it wasn't in the way you mean it, in the way the palace would have meant it if they'd found him instead of me. Let me tell it right, because telling it right is the whole reason I've kept it all these years. The scribe was a young man. I'll not give his name even now. He's paid enough, Junior, quiet. One of the small invisible people who copy the documents the great need copied, trusted with sealed things precisely because he was nobody. Because a nobody scribe has no faction and no motive, and is the safest pair of hands for a secret. Which is exactly the reasoning that put the princess's sealed medical truth in front of a young man whose own life the palace had never once thought to ask about. And his life, when I finally looked at it, when I did the thing the palace never does, which is to look at the actual life of the small, invisible person, his life had a hole in it the exact shape of the leak. He had a sister, younger and ill with something like what the princess had, a wasting thing in the lower town, in poverty, dying the way the poor die, unattended, uncomforted, without physicians or sealed reports or a household keeping vigil. Just a poor girl wasting in a cold room with a brother who loved her and could do nothing. And the scribe, copying the princess's sealed reports day after day, the detailed physician's accounts of a wasting illness, the treatments tried, the careful learned writing about exactly the kind of sickness that was killing his own sister in a cold room across the city. The scribe had done a thing that wasn't a leak for money or faction or spite. He'd copied parts of them for himself, stolen the medical knowledge, taken the physician's detailed accounts of how the princess's wasting illness was being treated, what helped, what eased it, and carried that stolen knowledge home to his dying sister, to try to give her, a poor girl in a cold room, some fraction of the care a princess got, because he could not bear to hold in his hands every day the detailed saving knowledge being lavished on one dying girl, while his own dying girl had nothing. That was the leak, not a leak at all in the heart of it, a brother stealing a princess's medical care to try to save his sister. And it had gotten out, the stolen copies, carried through the lower town, shown to a backstreet apothecary. The scribe begged for help, passed hand to hand, and somewhere in that desperate passage the sealed particulars had slipped into the gossip stream and become the scandal the whole palace was now hanging Lady Morwen for. The princess's secret hadn't been spread to shame her or serve a faction. It had leaked out the back of one poor man's love for his dying sister, through an apothecary's loose mouth, into a world that turned a brother's desperation into a dowager's conspiracy, because a dowager's conspiracy was a better story. The lower town where the thread led, and what I found at the end of it. The thread led, in the end, out of the palace entirely, down into the lower town, and I have to take you there, because it's where the truth stopped being an abstraction and became a girl in a cold room. I followed the scribe on his free days, the way he went out the servants' gates, down through the good streets and then the lesser ones and then the streets that aren't good at all, the lower town where I'd been born, where the poor of the city live their short, hard lives, and I followed him to a narrow house in a narrow lane, and I watched him go in, and I waited, and eventually I found a way to see what was inside, and what was inside was the truth, and it broke me a little. A room, cold, poor, a pallet, and on the pallet a girl younger than the scribe, wasted thin by the same kind of illness that was taking the princess, the same wasting, the same slow, cruel thing, except where the princess had a household and physicians and sealed reports, and every care the kingdom could buy. This girl had a cold room and a brother and nothing at all, the same disease and none of the care, the brutal arithmetic of the world laid out in two dying girls. One in a palace and one in a hovel, the same sickness, opposite worlds. And I watched the scribe tend her. Watched him take out the stolen pages. I knew them at once, the physician's hand, the sealed reports he'd copied for himself and read from them, and try, with his poor means, to do for his sister some fraction of what the pages described being done for the princess. The treatments, the easings, the small mercies of care that the sealed knowledge held. A brother trying to nurse his dying sister out of stolen medical reports in a cold room, with none of the means the reports assumed, doing his desperate best to give a poor girl a shadow of a princess's care. That was the leak. That was the great scandal the palace was hanging Lady Morwen for. A boy reading medical pages to his dying sister in a hovel, because he'd held in his hands every day the detailed knowledge being lavished on one dying girl, and could not bear to let his own dying girl have nothing. I stood outside that cold room and I understood that I'd found the truth, and that the truth was the saddest thing I'd ever found, and that there was no villain in it anywhere, only a sickness and two girls and a brother's unbearable love. And I understood why the palace would never have reached this truth in 1,000 years, because the palace was looking for a villain and there wasn't one. There was only grief, and grief is invisible to a court that's decided it's hunting a crime. I sat with that for a long time before I did anything. I want you to understand the weight of what I was holding, because it wasn't simple, none of it was simple. I'd found the truth, and the truth cleared Lady Morwen completely. She'd never had the reports, never leaked anything, was being destroyed by the palace for a thing she had no part in, on no evidence but her coldness. And the truth convicted instead a young scribe whose crime was loving his dying sister too much to hold healing knowledge in his hands and not steal it for her. If I brought the truth to light, I'd clear an innocent the palace hated, and I'd hang a guilty man the palace would never have suspected and who deserved, by the cold letter of it, to hang. He had broken the seal, spread the princess's secret. It didn't matter that his reason was love. The law doesn't weigh reasons, the law weighs the broken seal. Clear the cold woman, hang the loving man. That was what the truth did if I let it all out. And neither half of that sat clean. Morwen deserved clearing. But the scribe deserved something. Some justice, yes. But did he deserve the rope? Did he deserve what the palace would do to a man who'd leaked the princess's medical secret? The full machinery of vengeance brought down on a brother who'd only wanted to save his sister with stolen pages. The truth I'd found was just as much a tangle of mercy and cruelty as the lie the palace was living. I'd gone looking for the truth thinking it would be clean, would simply fix the wrong, and instead I'd found a truth that fixed one wrong by committing another. That couldn't be told without destroying a man whose only crime was loving wrongly, desperately, the way the cornered poor love. Who to tell the choice of where the truth went, which was its own kind of decision. When I had the truth whole, the scribe, the sister, the stolen pages, the whole sad shape of it, I had a choice that I've come to think mattered as much as any other in the whole affair. Who to tell? And the obvious answer, the proper answer, the answer my 40 years of training screamed was, tell the household, tell the official hunters. Bring the truth to the authority that was running the investigation and let them do with it what authority does. That's the chain of it. A guard who finds the truth brings it up the chain. That's how it's supposed to work, and I knew exactly how it would work if I did it. The household would take the truth, and the household would not be merciful. The household would do the thing the machinery does, would hunt down the scribe and break him and hang him, would clear Morwen with one hand while destroying the brother with the other, would turn my sad human truth into a clean, brutal justice. Because that's what the machinery is built to do. It doesn't do mercy, it does justice. And justice here meant a rope for a man who'd loved his dying sister. So I didn't tell the chain. I made the decision alone that this truth was too dangerous to hand to the machinery, that the machinery would do a monstrous just thing with it, and that I'd rather carry it to the one person whose stake in it gave her the right to decide, the wrongly accused woman herself, Morwen, who could be cleared by it, and so had earned the right to choose whether to be. I took the truth to the victim of the lie instead of to the enforcers of justice, because the victim might choose mercy and the enforcers never would. And that choice, to root the truth around the machinery, to the one person who might be merciful with it, was the quiet hinge the whole rest turned on. If I'd done the proper thing and told the chain the scribe hangs, Morwen is cleared against her will and the mercy never happens. By choosing where to put the truth, I made the mercy possible. It wasn't my mercy in the end, it was Morwen's. She's the one who chose it. But I made it possible by deciding the truth shouldn't go to the people who'd have been just with it. Sometimes the most important choice isn't what the truth is. It's who you let hold it. I gave it to the one who might be kind. And she was, more than I could have dreamed. And that's the whole reason this is a story about mercy instead of a story about a hanging. I went to Lady Morwen. Of all the people I might have taken the truth to, I took it to her, the woman it cleared, the cold woman I didn't even like, because something told me that the person wrongly accused had earned the right to decide what was done with the truth that cleared her, and because I'd seen her weep in a corridor, and I wanted, I think, to understand the weeping before I understood anything else. I told her what I'd found, all of it, the scribe, the sister, the stolen pages, the apothecary, the desperate love that had become the leak. I told her she was innocent and I could prove it, that I could take this to the household and clear her name and turn the palace's hatred onto the true source. And I watched the cold, proud face of Lady Morwen take it in, the news that she could be cleared, that the thing destroying her standing and her name could be lifted, that she could have her vengeance on the truth and her vindication before the whole court that had convicted her. And she said no. She said no, and then she told me the thing that made sense of the corridor, the weeping, the loose thread I'd never been able to fit. She told me why she'd been at the princess's sickbed, late and alone and weeping, the cold stepmother who supposedly hated the girl. She'd lost a daughter. Long ago, before any of this court knew her, in her first life, the one before she became the armored dowager, she'd had a daughter, young, who died of a wasting illness very like the princess's, died slow over a season while a young Morwen sat helpless at her bed, and that loss was the thing under the armor, the thing the armor was built to cover, 40 years of cold pride built over a grief that had never closed. And the Princess Caitrin, wasting away in the sick room, was unbearable to her not because she hated the girl, but because the girl was dying the exact death her daughter had died, was tearing the scar of it open in her, and the coldness everyone read as enmity had been, all along, a woman holding herself rigid against a grief too close to bear, and the late lonely visits to the sickbed had been Morwen unable to stay away, going to sit with a dying girl because she could not, the second time, do what she'd failed to do the first time, which was simply be there, be present, not leave the dying girl alone the way, she believed wrongly, the way the grieving always believe, she'd somehow failed her own daughter. Morwen's daughter, the grief under the armor, told fuller, because it's the key to everything. That night when Morwen told me about her daughter, she told me more than I've given you, and I'll set it down, because it's the thing that turned a cold villain into the truest person I ever served, and it deserves its whole weight. She'd been young, she said, in another kingdom in the life before she came to this court, married young, a daughter early, and then the illness, the wasting, the same slow thing when the girl was small. And Morwen, young then, not yet armored, had done everything, spent everything, begged every physician and watched it all fail, watched her daughter go down by inches over a season exactly the way the Princess Caitrin was now going down. And at the end, this is the part she could barely say, 40 years on, the cold voice cracking on it, at the end she had not been there. Some cruelty of timing, some errand she'd been sent on believing there was more time, and the girl had died while Morwen was away, died without her mother there, and Morwen had come back to a dead child and a chance forever gone to simply be present at the end, and she had never, in 40 years, forgiven herself for the not being there, had built the whole cold armored dowager over that one unhealing wound, the proud sharp woman a fortress raised on a mother's worst grief. And the Princess Caitrin's illness had torn it all open, of course it had. The same wasting, the same slow going down, a young woman dying the exact death her daughter died. Morwen could not look at it and stay whole, and the coldness everyone read as her hatred of the girl was a woman holding herself together by main force against a grief that was clawing out of its 40-year grave. And the late lonely visits to the sickbed, The thing I'd seen and never understood, that was Morwen unable to stay away, going to sit with the dying princess because this time, this one time, she could do the thing she'd failed to do for her own daughter. She could be there, be present, not let the dying girl be alone at the end the way her own girl had been alone. She wasn't visiting Caitrin out of love for Caitrin, exactly. She was visiting her out of a 40-year-old need to finally be present at a deathbed she kept failing to reach in time, to give a dying girl the presence she'd failed to give her own, a kind of penance, a kind of mothering offered late to a stranger because the one it was meant for was 40 years in the ground. That's what I'd seen weeping in the corridor. Not a conspirator. A mother still, after everything, doing for a stranger's dying what she'd never forgiven herself for not doing for her own. So now you see why she said no to being cleared, and it's the heart of everything, and I've never gotten over it. Lady Morwen would not let me expose the scribe. Because the scribe's crime was a brother trying to save a dying sister with stolen medical knowledge, and Morwen was a mother who'd lost a dying daughter and would have stolen anything, broken any seal, burned down any palace for one more chance to save her. She heard the scribe's story and she did not hear a criminal. She heard herself. She heard the thing she would have done, gladly, damningly, for her own girl, if anyone had held the saving knowledge and she'd had a way to take it. And she would not. She said this to me in the cold, proud voice gone quiet. She would not be cleared at the price of hanging a man for loving his dying sister the way she had loved her dying daughter. She would rather wear the false guilt. She would rather let the whole palace go on believing she'd leaked the secret out of spite, would rather carry that, than buy her vindication with the life of a brother whose only crime was the love she'd have killed to be able to act on. Let them think it was me, she said. I am old and hard and they already hate me, and it costs me little to be hated for one more thing. Let the boy keep his sister and his life. I will not trade his love for my name. I have never, before or since, seen anything like it. The coldest woman in the palace, the convicted villain of every gossip's tongue, choosing to keep the false guilt that was destroying her standing rather than save herself by destroying a poor man whose grief mirrored her own. The palace had built her into a villain out of her coldness, and the truth was that under the coldness was the most merciful person in the whole rotten place, merciful in the one way that costs everything, the mercy that pays its own name and reputation to spare a stranger. They hanged her in their whispers for a leak she didn't commit. She let them, to save a man they'd never have shown an ounce of the mercy she showed him. The night of the choice deepened, because her refusal is the soul of the story. When she refused to be cleared that night, I argued with her. I have to tell you I argued, because her choice was so against her own interest that I couldn't just accept it, and the arguing is where the depth of it came out. I told her she was being a fool, plainly. I told her the palace was destroying her, that the false guilt would follow her to her grave, that she'd be the leaker forever in every eye, that her name and her standing and what remained of her place at court would all be lost for a crime she didn't commit, and that all of it could be lifted, instantly, just by letting me tell the truth. I told her the scribe had committed a real crime, that the law would call it just to punish him, that she owed him nothing, that he was a stranger who'd broken a seal and spread the princess's secret and nearly gotten her destroyed for it, and that she'd be mad to wear his guilt to save him. I made every argument. I was trying to save her, you understand, from her own mercy, the way you try to stop someone walking willingly into a fire. And she heard me out, the cold, proud woman, and then she said the thing I've carried 40 years. She said, I know what it is to want to save a dying girl and have no way. I know it better than anyone in this palace. If I had held the knowledge that might have eased my daughter and it had been a princess's sealed secret, I would have stolen it, and I would have broken any seal, and I would have spread it to the four winds if spreading it bought her one easy hour. The boy did what I would have done. I will not hang a man for the thing I would have done, the thing I would give my soul to have had the chance to do. Let them blame me. Blaming me costs a cold, old woman her reputation, which she values less than they think. Hanging him costs a dying girl her brother and a brother his life, and the world one more proof that love is a crime if you're poor enough. I will pay my reputation. I will not let him pay his life. And that was the end of the arguing, because there's no arguing with a grief that has become a mercy that total. And I stopped trying to save her from it and just bowed my head, because I understood I was in the presence of something I'd never seen in a palace and never would again. A person choosing to be hated to spare a stranger, with her eyes wide open, for reasons that came straight up out of the deepest wound of her life. The confrontation, the scribe, face to face, the hardest conversation of my life. I told you, I went to the scribe and let him believe for a moment his life was over. I want to tell that scene fuller, because it was the hardest conversation of my life, and I didn't handle all of it well, and you should have the truth of that too. When I came to him alone, in a quiet place, having arranged it so we'd not be seen, he knew. The moment he saw my face, he knew that I knew, and a young man's face going from fear to certainty to a kind of collapse is a terrible thing to watch, and I watched it, and I did a thing I'm not proud of, which is that I let my own anger out first before my mercy, because I was angry. I'd found the truth, and the truth was sympathetic, but it was also real harm. His theft had spread a dying woman's secret to the world, had nearly destroyed an innocent old woman, had turned Caitrin's last privacy into market gossip, and all of that was real no matter how good his reasons. And I was angry at the size of the harm his love had done, and I let him feel that anger before I let him feel the mercy, made him sit in the full weight of what he'd caused, the violation. The near destruction of Morwen, all of it laid at his feet. I wanted him to know. I think I needed him to know that love isn't a clean excuse, that his desperate love had done desperate harm to people who'd done nothing to him, and that the goodness of his motive didn't unmake the badness of the result. And he took it. That's the thing. He didn't defend himself, didn't plead his sister, didn't make excuses. He took the full weight of what I laid on him, wept under it, agreed with all of it, said he'd known, had always known that what he did was wrong, that he'd told himself it was only for his sister, and known even as he told himself that the secret was spreading past his control, that he'd done a wrong thing for a love he couldn't help and would carry it forever. And his taking it, his not defending himself, his full owning of the harm, was the thing that finally let my anger go and my mercy come, because a man who fully owns the harm he's done out of love is not a villain, is just a person who was cornered by an impossible thing and chose wrong and knows it, and you can't hate that, or I couldn't, not once the anger had burned off. So I told him the rest then, that he wouldn't hang, that Morwen had chosen to spare him, that he could keep his sister. And I watched a man who'd been certain he was about to die for love receive, instead, a stranger's mercy he'd never earned and couldn't believe, and it broke him open worse than the fear had, because mercy you don't deserve breaks a person more than punishment you do. And he wept in a way that I've only seen a few times in my life, the weeping of someone spared who knows exactly how little they deserve the sparing. We did it her way. I'll tell you what we did, because it's not clean and you should have the not clean truth. I went to the scribe quietly, alone, the way I'd gone to Morwen. I didn't bring the law. I told him I knew all of it, the sister, the pages, the apothecary. And I watched a young man crumble in front of me, certain his life was over, certain the rope was coming, and I let him believe it for a moment because, God forgive me, I wanted him to feel the size of what he'd done. The real harm, the princess's privacy spread to the world, the innocent woman nearly destroyed for it. His love had been real, but his love had done real damage, and he needed to know it. And then I told him the rest, that he would not hang, that a woman he'd never met, the very Dowager the world blamed for his leak, had chosen to keep the blame rather than let him be exposed, that his sister could keep him. And I gave him the one thing the situation allowed, which was a way out that harmed no one further. He would leave. Quietly resign his post, vanish into the lower town, take his sister and what care he could give her and disappear from the palace's world entirely, so that the true source was simply gone, untraceable, the investigation allowed to die for lack of a thread, and Lady Morwen's quiet false guilt allowed to stand, as the thing the palace believed without anyone ever being formally hanged for it at all. It wasn't justice, I know that. The princess's secret stayed spread. You can't unspread a secret. The scribe went unpunished by the law for a real crime. Morwen kept a false guilt she didn't deserve. None of it was clean. But it was the most mercy the situation could hold. The innocent woman chose her own false guilt with open eyes. The desperate brother kept his life and his sister. And no one was hanged, no one was broken. The machinery of palace vengeance that wanted a body got no body. Because two people, a cold dowager and an old guard, decided quietly between them that the truth, fully told, would do more harm than a merciful silence. We buried the truth to protect the guilty but pitiable, and we let an innocent carry false blame because she chose to. And if that's a sin, then it's the kind I'll answer for gladly, because the alternative was a hanging, and the hanging would have been just, and the justice would have been monstrous. The Princess Caitrin died that winter. I should tell you so you're not left hoping. The wasting illness took her, the way it takes, slow and then all at once, and the kingdom mourned her the way it had been going to mourn her all along, and the leaked secret became, in the end, a small ugly footnote to a large clean grief, forgotten in the greater sorrow of losing her. She never knew, I think, the truth of the leak, never knew a scribe had stolen her medical care to save his sister, never knew her cold stepmother had taken false blame to spare him. She died inside the household's love, which is what the household had wanted for her from the start, and the leak, for all the noise it made, didn't take that from her in the end. That's the one mercy in the whole sad business. She died loved and tended and not alone, and the ugly footnote stayed a footnote. And Lady Morwen carried the false guilt to her own grave a few years later. The palace never fully forgave her for a leak she didn't commit. She lived out her years under the soft, permanent suspicion of it, the cold dowager who everyone knew had spread the dying princess's secret, and she never once defended herself, never once told the truth that would have cleared her, because clearing herself meant exposing the scribe, and she would not, to the end, trade his love for her name. She and I never spoke of it again after that night. But she knew that I knew, and sometimes, across a crowded hall, the cold, proud dowager would find my eyes for a moment, the old guard who'd offered to clear her and been refused, and something would pass between us, not warmth exactly. She had no warmth to give, but a kind of grave acknowledgement. Two people who shared the one true thing in a palace full of lies, who knew between them that the most hated woman in the court was secretly the most merciful, and who had agreed without ever saying it, to let the lie stand, because the lie was kinder than the truth. What I took on myself, the cost of keeping the secret, since I keep it still. I should be honest about what it cost me, keeping this, because I've kept it 40 years and the keeping was its own long wait. I knew the truth and I told no one, not the household, not the official hunters, not anyone who might have done something official with it. I let Morwen's false guilt stand. I let the scribe vanish unpunished. I let the investigation die for lack of a thread, helped it die, in fact, quietly steered the few who still cared away from the lower town, away from the scribe, protected the truth by burying it. And that made me, in the eyes of any law, a kind of accomplice after the fact, a man who knew who'd committed a real crime and concealed it, who let an innocent wear false blame, who interfered with the household's justice for reasons of my own mercy. If it had ever come out that I'd known and concealed, I'd have been finished, worse than finished, and I carried that risk for 40 years, the knowledge that I'd made myself guilty of concealment to protect a guilty but pitiable man and a falsely blamed merciful woman. And there was a quieter cost, which was simply the carrying. Knowing a true thing the whole world has wrong is a weight that doesn't ease. Every time I heard someone speak of Morwen as the leaker, and I heard it for years, the soft, permanent suspicion that followed her to her grave I knew and could say nothing, and the knowing and saying nothing wore a groove in me. I'd watch them slander a merciful woman as a cold conspirator, and I'd hold my tongue because telling the truth meant breaking the mercy she'd chosen. And so I protected her sacrifice by enduring, silently, the slander it bought her, which is a strange, exhausting kind of loyalty, to honor someone's choice to be hated by helping them be hated, by never defending them even when you alone could. She chose the false guilt. The most loyal thing I could do was let her keep it, and letting her keep it meant standing silent through 40 years of hearing her wrongly blamed, and I did, because it was hers to choose and she'd chosen, and a man honors a sacrifice by not undoing it, even when undoing it would feel like justice. I kept the silence. It was the hardest guarding I ever did, guarding a lie that protected a truth for 40 years alone. The villains we invent, the lesson, the thing I most need you to take. I've thought all the years since about why the palace needed Morwen to be guilty, why the true story, the grieving brother, the merciful stepmother, no villain anywhere, was so impossible for the court to reach or accept. And here's what I've come to, the lesson under the whole tale. A palace, a court, a town, any crowd of frightened people, when something bad happens, they don't actually want the truth. They want a villain. The truth and a villain are different things, often opposite things, and the crowd wants the villain more, because a villain can be hated and punished and cast out, and the hating and punishing and casting out feels like safety, feels like the bad thing has been dealt with, the wound closed. The truth, when there's no villain in it, when the bad thing came from grief or accident or desperate love, or the simple cruelty of a world where two girls get the same sickness and only one gets care. The truth gives the crowd nothing to hate, nothing to punish, no way to feel safe again, and so the crowd refuses it, reaches past it, and invents the villain it needs. They invented Morwen because they needed someone to hate more than they needed to be right, and Morwen's coldness made her the cheapest available villain, and the real story had no villain to offer them, only grief, and you cannot satisfy a frightened crowd with grief. They don't want to understand the grief. They want to hate the villain, and if there's no villain, they'll build one out of the nearest unloved person to hand. That's the thing I learned, the thing I've carried, the thing I most want you to take from a tale about a leak that wasn't a leak. When you hear the name everyone says, when the crowd is certain, when the villain is clear, when the story is clean and the guilty party is exactly the person you'd most enjoy being guilty, that is precisely the moment to doubt, to go looking, to ask not who benefits but what's the loose thread, because the clean villain the crowd is certain of is very often a cold, unloved person being buried under true small grains arranged by want. And the real truth is very often a sad human thing with no villain in it at all, invisible to everyone because it offers no one to hate. The name everyone said was wrong. It's almost always wrong. The truth was sadder and truer and had a mother's 40-year grief at the bottom of it. And I'm the only one who ever went looking, and I found no villain. And the finding of no villain is the truest thing I ever did in 40 years of guarding. I'm old now and Morwen's long dead, and the scribe's an old man somewhere if he lives, and his sister. I never knew if the stolen care saved her, if the pages a brother risked everything for bought her any time, and I've chosen not to find out because I'd rather hold the hope than learn the answer. And I'm telling this at last because I've watched, my whole life, how a palace decides who's guilty, and it's never the truth. It's always the name people already wanted to say, and Lady Morwen was the name they wanted to say because she was cold and proud and unloved, and the realness of who leaked the secret, a poor man's desperate love, was a thing no gossip would ever reach for because it wasn't a satisfying enough villain. They wanted a wicked dowager. The truth was a grieving brother and a merciful stepmother, and a secret that leaked out the back of too much love, and there was no villain in it anywhere. Not one, only desperate people doing desperate things for the dying they couldn't save. And the palace took that and made it a tale of conspiracy and spite, because conspiracy and spite are easier to hate than grief is to understand. So here's the whole of it, the true story under the name everyone said. Lady Morwen never leaked the princess's secret. A scribe did, by stealing her medical care for his dying sister, and the theft slipped out into the world through an apothecary's loose mouth and became a scandal. And when the truth was found, the wrongly accused woman chose to keep the false blame rather than expose the desperate man, because she'd lost a daughter to the same illness and could not bear to punish a brother for the love she'd have died to give her own child. The palace hanged the wrong person in its whispers, and the wrong person let it. Out of a mercy the palace was too busy hating her to imagine. That's the truth. It clears no one cleanly, and it hangs no one cleanly, and it has no villain in it. And that's exactly why it's true, because the real truth almost never has a villain in it. The real truth is almost always just frightened, grieving people doing harm to each other while reaching for the ones they love. And the villains are something the watching world invents afterward, so the mess will have a shape it can hate. I've kept it 40 years so that somewhere the true version exists, not the name everyone said. The truth no one wanted, because it was too sad and too human, and had no one in it worth hating. Lady Morwen was innocent and merciful and died blamed. Remember her that way if you remember her at all. She was the coldest woman I ever served and the truest, and the palace never knew her, and I did, and now you do, and that's the only justice she ever got or ever let herself have. Aldous, of the inner household, who went looking for a villain and found only grief, and kept the truth so that one cold, merciful woman would not be only the name everyone said.